Okay, in the concluding presentation of the day, I would like to talk about Trevor Dupuy's theory of combat. Particularly, I would like to talk about it as an abstracted concept without referencing the numbers and equations of his models. His quantified judgment model, or QJM, and its successor, the tactical numerical deterministic model, or TNDM, are formal expressions of his theory of combat. They spell out in mathematical detail the variables and processes he believed to constitute phenomenon of military combat. The details of the models are probably better known than the elements of his theory of combat. Models and simulations, war games, and military doctrine are all theories of combat. Theories about, as Stephen Biddle said, what causes victory and defeat in battle, why the winners win and the losers lose. However, the designers and creators of these models, simulations, war games, and doctrine rarely articulate these fundamental theories explicitly, much less openly discuss or debate them. Be sure there's a large body of literature on theories of warfare, operations, and tactics, and a loud, robust debate on the nature of military activities. There's plenty of discussion of modeling methods and techniques, details of war game design, and the relevance and change in doctrine. But when we discuss and debate how and why we believe these various analytical tools actually represent the real-world phenomena they purport to explain and forecast. The accuracy and utility of these tools is to improve. This probably needs to change. Trevor Dupuy uniquely publicly published the details of his combat model and very capably and clearly laid out his theory of combat in detail in his publications, specifically Numbers, Predictions in War, The Evolution of Weapons in Warfare, and Understanding War. Now, in Understanding War, Dupuy defined what he considered to be a theory of combat as the embodiment of a set of fundamental principles governing and explaining military combat, whose purpose is to provide the formulation of doctrine and to assist military commanders and planners to engage successfully in combat at any level. Such a theory includes the following elements: identifying the major elements of combat and the combat processes through which they operate and patterns in the interactions and relationships among them. 2, describing combat structures and patterns of interactions and relationships of variable factors that constantly shape or determine the outcome of combat. And 3, expressing in quantitative terms the patterns so identified and described. Now, it seems to me this is kind of a tall order for a combat model with 100,000 variables. How to explain how that model actually functions as a theory of combat. Dupuy started by defining military combat. His definition of military combat is a violent, planned form of physical interaction, fighting between two hostile opponents, where at least one party is an organized force, recognized by governmental or de facto authority, and one or both opposing parties hold one or more of the following objectives: to seize control of territory or people, to prevent the opponent from seizing or controlling territory or people, to protect one's own territory or people, or to dominate, destroy, or incapacitate the opponent. The impact of weapons creates an environment of lethality, danger, and fear in which achievement of the objectives by one party may require the opponent to choose among continued resistance and resultant destruction, retreat and loss of territory, facilities, and people, or surrender. Military combat begins in any interaction or at any level of combat, from duel to full-scale war, when weapons are first employed with hostile intent by one or both opponents. Military combat ends for any interaction or level of combat when both sides have stopped fighting. There are 2 points of this definition that Dupuy said he wished to emphasize. He said, though there may be much in common between military combat and a brawl in a barroom, there are important differences. The opponents in military combat are to some degree organized. Both represent a government or quasi-governmental authority. There is one other essential difference: the all-pervasive influence of fear in a lethal environment. People have been killed in barroom brawls, but this is exceptional. In military combat, there is a constant danger of death from lethal weapons employed by opponents with deadly intent. Fear is without question the most important characteristic of combat. Now, for a lot of people who are only superficially familiar with Trevor Dupuy, a lot of people accuse him of basically trying to define combat or war as a mathematical formula. The opposite is in fact the case. He placed primacy on a human factor, fear. He considered that to be the most important constituent of his theory of combat. Now, the fundamental concept in his theory of combat is combat power. Very simple combat power. He, in his books, defined it through an equation. But it can be boiled down to a simple sentence, which is combat power is the product of force, strength, or lethality, and the circumstantial, environmental, operational, and moral human variables circumstantial to every engagement. If you wanted to try and boil down his theory of combat to the lowest, simplest expression, it would be superior combat power always wins. Now, what you see in the equation form of this concept of combat power that I would emphasize here is that combat power is the product, which means these elements multiply. His basic conception of combat power involved factors that multiplied. However, force strength lethality was additive. In other words, force strength is not the biggest part of combat power. It's the circumstantial variables that multiply lethality. Now, Dupuy formulated his concept of theory of combat and built his model before he realized it was essentially the same as something he refers to as Clausewitz's law of numbers. Dupuy ended up believing that basically his concept was drawn, his concept was essentially the same as the idea that Clausewitz expresses in book 3 of chapter 8. Again, because let's see if I have that written. Something not even. My slide.
Can you track that? Yeah, right.
There we go. And this is something that Trevor quotes at length in Understanding War. Clausewitz wrote, "In tactics, as in strategy, superiority of numbers is the most common element of victory. If we thus strip the engagement of all the variables arising from its purpose and circumstance, and disregard the fighting value of the troops involved, which is a given quantity, we're left with the bare concept of the engagement, a shapeless battle in which only distinguishing factors is the number of troops on either side. These numbers, therefore, will determine victory. It is, of course, evident from the massive abstractions I have made to reach this point that superiority of numbers in a given engagement is only one of the factors that determines victory. Superior numbers, far from contributing everything or even a substantial part to victory, may actually be contributing very little depending on the circumstances. But superiority varies in degree. It can be 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 or 4 to 1 and so on. It can obviously reach the point where it is overwhelming. In this sense, superiority of numbers admittedly is the most important factor in the outcome of the engagement, as long as it is great enough to counterbalance all other contributing circumstances. It thus follows that as many troops as possible should be brought into the engagement at the decisive point." Now, the concept of force strength in his concept of combat power is simply the number of weapons and personnel in a force. There have been a lot of discussions lately. One of the buzzwords in DoD and elsewhere is lethality, the concept of lethality and the need to constantly increase lethality. Dupuy had a very simple definition of lethality, which is the ability to injure and, if possible, to kill people. For him, lethality and combat power were not synonymous. They're not the same thing. Lethality is a component of combat power. Now, in his models, he calculated force strength using the theoretical lethality index or operational lethality index. TLIs and OLIs are just a firepower scoring methodology. There are lots of ways to score firepower. The methodology that Dupuy uses in his models was created in 1964 as part of a larger study, simply to be able to compare the lethality of weapons to each other and through time. Theoretically, any objective firepower scoring method properly calibrated with Dupuy's models will probably work just as well. In other words, there's nothing magic about the TLIs or OLIs other than it is an objective way of measuring lethality of weapons, and it's calibrated with his models. The other thing to note about this is that additional units of force strength are additive and not multiplicative. I mention that because when you hear members of the U.S. Army talk about force multipliers, combat multipliers, what they really mean are non-organic elements of firepower or some extra capability added to a force. You're not really talking about force multipliers in the way that Trevor Dupuy thinks of force multipliers, which are these circumstantial variables that multiply firepower. So this is a list of what he considered to be the circumstantial variables of combat. The QJM actually represents, I think, 78 different variables. If we group them into environmental, operational, and behavioral circumstantial variables. Environmental, just the factors of terrain, weather, and season. Operational, posture and fortifications, mobility, vulnerability, air superiority, weapon sophistication, etc. The ones he considered most important were the behavioral or moral variables. Leadership, disruption, quality of forces and manpower, relationship of physical and moral factors. Now, the reason he believed that fear in a lethal environment was the most important factor in combat was a finding of that original 1964 study where the chart on the left shows the increase of lethality of weapons over time. And beginning around 1800, you start seeing a very rapid increase in individual weapon lethality. What he found, looking at historical combat data, is that even though weapons were becoming more lethal, average daily combat casualty rates were declining, which seems counterintuitive. The reason for this is as weapons became more lethal, forces on the battlefield started to disperse more. And the reason for that this is the one basic reason for dispersal of troops on modern battlefields, to mitigate the lethal effects of firepower upon troops. As Lewis Richardson wrote in the Statistics of Deadly Quarrels, there is a limit to the amount of punishment human beings can sustain. Dispersion was resorted to as a tactical response to firepower, mostly because as weapons became more lethal in the 17th century, soldiers were already beginning to disperse without official sanction. This was because they sensed that on the bloody battlefields of that century that they were approaching the limit of the punishment men could stand. This is what led Dupuy to concur with Karl von Clausewitz's assertion that passion, emotion, and fear are the fundamental characteristics of combat. No one who's participated in combat can disagree with this Clausewitzian emphasis on passion, emotion, and fear. Without doubt, the single most distinctive and pervasive characteristic of combat is fear in a lethal environment. Despite the ubiquity of fear on the battlefield, Dupuy pointed out that there is no way to study its impact except through the historical record of combat in the real world. He said, we cannot replicate fear in laboratory experiments. We cannot introduce fear into field tests. We cannot create an environment of fear in training or in field exercises. So, to study human reaction in a battlefield environment, we have no choice but to go to the battlefield, not the laboratory, not the proving ground, not the training reservation. But because of the nature of the very characteristics of combat which we want to study, we can't study them during the battle. We can only do so retrospectively. We have no choice to rely on military history. This is why military history has been called the laboratory of the soldier. And this is one of the things that has led the U.S. Military Operations Research Committee to sort of hold Trevor Dupuy at an arm's length. There seems to be a fundamental disagreement as to whether or not human factors of the battlefield can actually be quantified or measured and quantified. Trevor Dupuy believed it was possible, believes he demonstrated how it could be done. The Military Operations Research Committee chooses to emphasize the physics aspects of combat. Measurable, how did they put it?
Physical.
Physics-based aspects of combat, which, as I tried to point out this morning, is leading analysis based on simply measuring the effects of weapons on battlefields to lead analysis astray. The prime way that Dupuy implemented human factors in his theory of combat was through the concept of relative combat effectiveness. Clear and consistent patterns in historical combat data led him to conclude that superior effectiveness on the battlefield was attributable to moral and behavioral or human factors. Those factors he believed were the most important contributors to combat effectiveness were leadership, training or experience, morale, which may or may not include cohesion. Okay, although the influence of human factors on combat effectiveness was identifiable and measurable in the aggregate, Dupuy was skeptical whether all of the individual moral and behavioral intangibles could be discretely quantified. He thought this particularly true for the set of factors that contributed to combat effectiveness, but were a blend of human and operational factors. These include logistical effectiveness, time and space, momentum, technical command control communications, intelligence, initiative, and chance. Dupuy grouped all of these intangibles together into a composite factor he designated as relative combat effectiveness value, or CEV. He did not believe that CEVs were static values. As with human behavior, they vary somewhat from engagement to engagement. He did think that human factors were the most substantial of the combat variables. Therefore, any model or theory of combat that failed to account for them would invariably be inaccurate. So basically, combat power is the fundamental concept behind his theory of combat. And to get a result in his model, you simply tally up the combat power for the attacker, combat power of the defender, and then express it as a ratio. Anything above 1.1 would be an attack success. Anything less than 0.09 would be defender success. Anything between 1.1 and 0.09 would be an indeterminate result. From that basic, simple concept, he produced a number of derivatives. His combat effectiveness concept, the new square law that I discussed earlier, his quantification of surprise, friction, and quantification of various force multipliers. Also from those, the study of historical combat data, you get his list of verities, the timeless verities of combat, combat advance rate verities, combat attrition verities, all elements of his study that he believed were essentially solid enough to be considered as factually rooted. He also considered them to be adjuncts to the principles of war, and he considered the 1954 edition of the Army's Field Manual to have the best summary of them. So that essentially is Dupuy's theory of combat in a nutshell.